Well, welcome to Reasons to Believe. My name is George Haraksin. I serve here as both the staff scholar and the director of the Scholar Community Program. Here we have about 250 scholar community members in various STEM fields, but we also have philosophers, medical doctors, lawyers, who all participate in being equipped and supporting one another in having science-faith discussions and opening up people to the gospel through science. So I want to welcome today one of our visiting scholars, part of our scholar community, and his name is Dr. David Winyard. David, welcome.
Good to be here.
We're glad to have you here. You rode your bike.
I did.
You're fit. You're ready. You're ready to go, right? Now, when I started in college, my first major, because I had multiple, was electrical engineering, and you are an engineer.
Yes.
Did you start out any particular type of engineering? What drew you to it? Just I want a little background.
Well, I grew up in the 60s watching the space launches, and that was always very fascinating to me. But it was always expressed in terms of science. Mm-hmm. And later on, I figured out that, well, science is what you did when you got home from the moon, but engineering got the astronauts there and back. Mm-hmm. So I was very interested in that. I also was exposed to plans to build a subway system in Baltimore. Mm. So civil engineering seemed like a cool profession too. But I ended up as a mechanical engineer.
Mechanical engineering. Now, we've talked before, and something that struck me is you called yourself a recovering engineer. So what did you have to recover from in engineering?
Well, yes, engineering was good for me, and I raised a family with 3 kids, and it was interesting work, fascinating work. But as I reached the end of my government career as an engineer, more and more I started to realize, there are things about engineering that aren't really good for me. Engineers are very self-sufficient people, and it's hard for me to trust God and to take things to God in prayer because I'm the guy who's supposed to make things happen. It's not going to happen by a miracle. And so when I talk about myself as a recovering engineer, I think of the habits that engineering education and work develops that are kind of counter to living a life devoted to Christ.
That's really interesting because as an ethicist, one of the areas of study is what's called virtue ethics, and virtue ethics has a lot to do with creating habits and habits of excellence that help a human being flourish. So even mechanical engineers, I hear you say, there are some virtues but can turn into different kinds of vices.
Yes, and engineering now is a much more socially oriented profession than it used to be because you have to work with diverse constituencies and users and all of that. And toward the end of my government career, it was very interesting to me how many times I would be preparing to go into a meeting and not knowing the outcome, and it was really a matter of faith. I wanted a particular outcome, but I wanted to be a good steward to my organization and faithful to God. So I remember frequently praying and thinking of James, the book of James, about making plans as a spiritual side of my engineering practice, but it was only at the end of my career. And now I teach engineering, and it's really good to be at a Christian school and to be able to talk about the spiritual aspects of engineering. If you're going to design and build something, you got to have faith in it.
Trust it, yeah.
Faith cannot be separated from engineering design. And where should that faith be resting? So resting in Christ.
No, that's great. It's interesting that you're bringing in not only to your science career a type of moral formation, but also spiritual formation, trying to think of that holistically. We have a number of people in the scholar community, as I mentioned. We have what's called an associate scholar track, and that's people who are just starting out in their careers. They're in a PhD program or something, and what we want people to be able to do is interact with people who are further down in their careers. In that, what encouragement, what wisdom would you give a budding engineer today?
In a graduate program?
Yeah, let's say they're in a graduate program and, or even if it's just someone's thinking about moving into a STEM field, they could be a high schooler wanting to choose this. That was me. I was a musician, but I had to do something practical like engineering, right? And the state school had a program, and I joined in it. But I wish I would have had mentors around me, or more. I wish I would have sought them out more.
Sure.
What encouragement, what wisdom would you give?
Well, when I went back to school to get teaching credentials to pursue a PhD, I did not do it in engineering. And I learned a lot about science and technology and society. And I was exposed to the deep, deep cultural influences in engineering. So I would encourage a young scholar to consider the values in different situations. And they can be different from one organization to another, from one field of engineering to another. I was exposed to the different cultures in the different military services. And engineers are not taught much about culture, but it matters a great deal.
Yeah.
And if you're bringing the Christian view into a situation, you need to understand how that culture will respond to the gospel. Otherwise, as a graduate student, I would encourage students to find a Christian to be on their advisory committee. I had a Christian on my committee due to workload situation. He had to leave. I replaced him with another Christian. And most schools will allow you to have at least one outsider from whatever school you're attending. Yeah. And so it worked out well for me to have a Christian on my committee.
Yeah, no, that's good. Me as a philosophy professor, as an ethicist, there's one thing I do with newer students is I raise the question of whether or not Jesus was a philosopher and a moral philosopher. And I think he was. I think you can make a case of that, just like he was a theologian, of course. But for most of his career, he was a builder. Back in the 70s, there was the book More Than a Carpenter. He was more than that, but when you look at the Greek word, he was a builder, maybe trained by Joseph, and he spent time in the blue-collar sector. Have you ever given much thought about that?
I have, but I go back a little farther. Yeah. What was the immediate response to the fall? There was the fashioning of a technological thing we call a garment.
Clothing, yeah.
we replaced the vines and fig leaves with a more substantial garment. So that I think there's theological significance there. I think that authorizes us to take natural resources and fashion them into ways we can survive better. So I think there's a theological message all the way back there in Genesis 3.
Yeah, connecting it all. And we'll get into more of that in just a moment. I'm a drummer, so I have favorite drummers. I'm a philosopher, so I have some favorite philosophers. Are there standout scientists, engineers in history? I know you've mentioned some before. Who I think you said Boyle was one that...
Robert Boyle is one that was especially interesting to me.
Yeah, why? Tell me about that.
Well, I was asked to participate in a summer church Sunday school series on Christian biographies. And at the time, I was taking a class where I had to read about Robert Boyle, and I thought, I don't have a lot of time, so maybe I can ask if I can talk about Robert Boyle, and they agreed. So I read the book that I was required to read. I read another book about him. He's a very fascinating guy. And the fact that a really real Bible-believing Christian was there at the start of experimental science, I think is very significant.
Yeah. Well, say just a little bit more about it. Why do you think it's so significant? Because he is struggling even during that time in the 1600s with science faith issues, science knowledge issues.
Right. Well, the idea that Christianity was involved, was at least present in the start of experimental science is generally agreed upon. But when I started taking STS courses, it kind of surprised me, because you hear so much about the conflict between science and faith that you aren't really aware of the fact that science would not have begun if it had not been for Christians taking an interest in what God had made. Robert Boyle and Isaac Newton and others pursued science, or natural philosophy as they called it, because they wanted to know more about God by looking at what he had made.
It's interesting that Boyle differed from Descartes during that time, in that Descartes didn't think you could gain knowledge about God through nature, but Boyle did, actually. He wrote quite a bit on theology, and even trying to demonstrate why the resurrection was scientifically based.
And it's interesting, too, to see how their natural philosophy ideas fit or clashed with Christian theology. So before the scientific revolution, there was a lot of qualitative Aristotelian science. And so we can figure out how things are going to operate just by thinking hard about them. But Boyle and Newton and others went into this idea of experimenting and letting the natural reactions dictate things. And the idea arose out of that we have natural laws. And so the idea that the universe was a great machine, a mechanical view of the universe took shape. Well, that was very consistent with the idea of predestination in the Reformed view. 100 years later, people realize, there's some problems with that. If the universe is a great machine, then we don't have any free will. And so people like Jonathan Edwards kind of pushed back on some of that. So theological ideas and our views of science and technology interact in interesting ways. I suppose now we can think of God as some kind of great artificial intelligence machine.
Some people might.
There you go. Some people would.
Well, you were also mentioning to me when you were reading about Boyle, some images you saw in a book that where it used to be the case that it really was the priests and others in a religion who had enough leisure time to do the science. Right. It didn't kind of get professionalized or coined that way till the late 1800s or so. But there was a sense, even growing out of that time, that science could replace religion. Can you talk about that?
Sure. One of the things, the context in which Boyle did his work was around the time of the English Revolution. And so issues of how the people were to be ruled and how much power the king had and how much others had was very much in the air. So Boyle and others that engaged in experimental philosophy were opposed by Thomas Hobbes, who's known as for his political philosophy. And so the book that I was obligated to read was this book by Stephen Shapin and Simon Schaefer called Leviathan and the Air Pump. And it's a very interesting description of the interaction between these two. So Hobbes was kind of offended by the experimentalists because he thought that the generation of new knowledge had to be legitimized by the crown.
Right.
And so his book, Leviathan, has a wonderful frontispiece, a visual image of the story that he tells, where he has the king looming over society with a sword in one hand and a bishop's crook in the other. And so Hobbes' idea was that the king wields power through the army and through the church. And we can't have people coming up with new ideas apart from that authority. And Boyle and his colleagues did not agree with that. And so they thought, well, we can do experiments. We can, seeing is believing was the epistemology of the time. And we can define the way in which the universe works by experiments. And of course, experimental science took off. But the kind of cryptic final sentence of this book is that Hobbes was right. And a lot of my colleagues in STS are like, what in the world does that mean? Well, what's meant by that is that every effort to generate new knowledge takes place in some kind of social context. And so today, science has more or less taken over from religion as an arm of the state. We make public policy based upon the science. We follow the science, right?
Or at least the interpretations from scientists.
That's right. And so Bruno Latour's comment on that is very interesting. He made the statement that science is politics by other means. For political power to be exercised nowadays, it has to have some kind of trappings of science.
Yeah. It's interesting, even in Boyle's time, though, he is part of starting the Royal Society, of science. So having science done in a social context was even already present in his own, how he was doing science. Right. And he had a group of friends and others that he partnered with. In fact, I think a recent article was written in Nature about his sister, that she had a lot of input in his life and others. He lived with her in that.
That's right. Boyle never got married, and so he and his sister were close. And you talk about social practices, the idea that we have journals and that scientists exchange information, and you have priority when you come up with a discovery. All of those things basically go back to Boyle and his colleagues in the Royal Society. I love their motto. It's like, take no man's word for it.
Test all things, hold on to
That's
what is
right.
hidden.
And so the idea of science as kind of organized skepticism kind of dates back to Boyle. If I have a super, super wonderful discovery, no one should believe me unless it can be repeated. And so this idea of organized skepticism is at the heart of our scientific practice even today.
Yeah. So let's move on to our contemporary moment and issues that we are having to deal with, or maybe there may be times issues that we're not aware of, but we should be aware of them, whether in the church or in our work environment, our field. You and I were talking about this convergence of technologies, right? And when that happens, that can really change a society. Right. And there's issues we can talk about in a moment about what's called transhumanism. But let's first talk about this convergence issue. Can you give an example or help us understand what that means?
Sure. Boyle's work in experimental science has led into all kinds of technological gadgets. And the way those things evolve is a subject of historians of science and technology. And every now and then, diverse views of the world and technology come together, and they produce dramatic changes. So the Protestant Reformation and the printing press, there's a big connection there. But there's a wonderful book by a man named David Winyard about the development of mass production methods in America. And he goes back and points to a number of developments in the 19th century that kind of came together in Henry Ford's assembly line, and the next thing you know, we have 20 million cars on the road. Yeah. So the idea of interchangeable parts meant nothing until the American armory system started pursuing that idea so that you could do field repairs of firearms on the battlefield. If you bought a firearm in the 17th century, well, you just went to a gunsmith and he handcrafted a one-of-a-kind unit for you, and interchangeable parts meant nothing. And now, you mean there was a time when we didn't have interchangeable parts? And so that was the beginning, and then the mass production of sewing machines by Singer and the cabinetry and other things, and then bicycle manufacturing in the 1890s. I'm a cyclist, so everything is a spin-off
related to cycling.
From cycling. This aviation thing is just a spin-off from the Wright brothers.
It's a temporary thing.
That's right. Flash in the pan. But anyway, all of those things kind of converged and produced the American capability to mass produce automobiles, and then, of course, mass produce tanks and planes and everything else to win World War II. It was inconceivable that you would have millions of cars or tens of thousands of airplanes in the beginning of the 1900s.
Yeah, and probably something you would point to now is almost an appendage to almost everybody, and that's a cell phone or a phone, which kind of leads us to this issue. You've gotten involved in what's called the transhumanism dialogue in that, and have interacted. First, tell us just briefly. I mean, at RTB, Dr. Fuzz Rana and Ken Samples wrote a book called Humans 2.0 that dealt with, which I know you're aware of and read, about this issue of transhumanism, Humans 2.0. So maybe give us just a quick background on what transhumanism is and what drew you into the discussion and kind of where you sit now.
Sure. Transhumanism was a suggestion from my advisor at Virginia Tech, Jim Collier, because I was very interested in how technology and Christianity fit together. And when I heard about it, it was like, oh, this is too far out. But as I studied it, there are a lot of religious connections that exist there with transhumanism. So transhumanism it essentially is a movement that would not only use science and technology to address our faults, the therapeutic things, but to make us more capable than we would naturally be as human beings. And the people that are looking at transhumanism look to a future convergence of a number of fields of knowledge. So we're very familiar with genetics and biotechnology. There are ways to modify our DNA and our other cell structures by nanotechnology. None of that could be done without the assistance of computers, so information technology is part of this. And then there is neuroscience. If we have digital computers that are mostly serial processing type things, but your mind, your brain is a massively parallel computer in essence. And so there's thought that if we can reverse engineer the brain, we can make massively more powerful computers. And then the final piece of the convergence they look to is robotics. That if your brain is in your biological body, but if we can take out of your brain all of the memories and thought patterns you have, we can instantiate that in a computer system, and we can embody you in some kind of robot. So all of those five techno-sciences, as you will, people envision coming together later this century to produce this transhumanist revolution.
Now, some people might say, well, what's wrong with that? I could go over to Disney over at Epcot, and you see a lot of these new technologies. They're very fond of being optimistic about the technologies. What is a concern or worry you have? I mean, some of this is going to happen whether we like it or not. I have questions as an ethicist. I work with data analytic people in big data, AI. What are some of your concerns?
Sure. There are ethical issues with each of these component parts of this transhumanist revolution. But when it crosses the line into a movement to achieve some of the goals of transhumanism, it becomes very much a religion. It gives us a hope that we might achieve, say, immortality by human ingenuity.
So it's salvific. It has its own gospel.
Exactly. Yeah. It becomes kind of it's been described as kind of a parody of Christian salvation, that Christians have faith that when Christ comes again, there will be a judgment and we will be resurrected, will be restored in our physical bodies, the bodies of a different sort, perhaps, because the New Testament points to that. But this would be a work of God and not the work of human ingenuity. And so transhumanism crosses the line from being a social and a technological project to becoming a religious project. And we have seen a kind of a decline of Christian faith due to the scientific revolution. People are more distrustful of religion than they were in Robert Boyle's day. And the same sort of thing looms large in terms of the technology, that if we can upload people's consciousness and if we can have artificial intelligence that's beyond human capacity, then what do we need God for? God's extraneous here.
We become the creators of our future in that particular case. What is there a way that, I mean, obviously you have engagements, dialogues, or interactions with persons like that. Let's take the transhumanist who doesn't have a theistic worldview, or at least purport to have one. How do you build bridges into dialoguing with that community?
Sure. Well, some of these aspirations to this parody of Christian salvation kind of points to something that's built into us as human beings, that the human beings were made for immortality, and were it not for the fall, we would not be suffering from death. And so overcoming death is something that every healthy human being aspires to. And so that we can point to things like that as being part of our essential humanity. This is the way we were made. We were made to be in relationship with one another. We were made to be in relationship with God, and we were made to enjoy that indefinitely without any kind of interruption of illness or death.
Yeah, there's a desire there for the good that we experience here to continue, but obviously the pain and the evil to stop. And that is at least part of the transhumanist goal is that therapeutic side to relieve suffering in that, but there's also the enhancement side, which I'm hearing you say there are points when they start to, for lack of better terms, to overly play God.
Right. It's a fuzzy thing in a way, because the line between therapeutic purposes of technology and enhancement is a little blurry. Computers today do things that are beyond human comprehension, and we rely upon them to do that work. But that's not that we regard that the computer as having a soul and all of that.
Now, there are some, we can look theologically or biblically, and God has created us as creators. We might say sub-creators or co-creators, we nuance those terms a little bit. But we're to do that under the authority of God, with His wisdom, right? That goes all the way back to the garden.
Right. Those are key words. Philip Hefner has this idea of created co-creators. And the problem with that is that it kind of elevates human beings to the place of God. But Tolkien's idea of a sub-creator is much closer to it. That our creative powers are always within the context of God's overarching creative power of creating things out of nothing. So the mere movement of atoms around to fashion something of our making is just a faint shadow of what God has done.
I was just reinvestigating some of Tolkien's work and his letters, and even when he was writing, the Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, and he was compelled to write the Silmarillion, the sort of the backstory, and go to a creation story. But if you even look at some of the stories that followed out of that were compiled, he even has a moment not only where God creates and is the ultimate creator, but how God has to enter into the story itself. I find that fascinating. So there are some people, though, that call themselves Christian transhumanists. Maybe a minority group. I don't know how large it is. Maybe you could explain that. But I was a pastor for many, many years. You get occupied with your congregation and things like that. Is this an advancement, in Christian thinking and theology? Is there more of a worry there? Is that sort of an oxymoron, even calling yourself a Christian transhumanist?
Is this an advancement? In my opinion, no. There are a number of people in the secular transhumanist movement that have religious backgrounds. So Red Kurzweil, I believe, was raised a Unitarian, and Martine Rothblatt is Jewish, and so there are people with religious sensibilities in the transhumanist movement. And then the Christian transhumanist movement has arisen as a way of essentially trying to integrate Christian faith and this idea of technological enhancement. And the problem with that organization is that they have refused to define what Christianity is. I was one of the early supporters of the Christian Transhumanist Association. If you go on their Facebook page, my name is listed on the history there. But the fundamental question of sociology is what binds us together. And if you're going to be a Christian organization, if Christian is the first name of the Christian Transhumanist Association,
Yeah.
then you really need to define that. And if you don't have some basis on which to build your affiliation there, you're in for trouble. And so the only thing that really unifies that organization is the faith in transhumanism. And so I've characterized the organization as a transhumanism advocacy organization and Christian in name only. They're moving away from that to some degree. They are trying to come up with more definitions of how transhumanism can be Christian. But I think it goes too far. I have no problem with the subsidiary pieces. There are ethical challenges with biotechnology and AI and all the rest. But I'm willing to go as far as we can go on those things. But when you cross the line and try to redeem what is a false gospel from the secular world and put the Christian label on it, there's something wrong with that. There's kind of a Constantinian approach to the things. That whatever the world does, Christians can do better. So we're going to slap the name Christian on there, and we'll be better transhumanists than the transhumanists. And that's just wrong. It's basically redefining what it is to be a transhumanist. It's redefining what it is to be a Christian.
So maybe one final aspect of this, as sub-creators, there's a power that we have that God has given us. It's not as controversial when we're dealing with therapeutic things, but when it comes to enhancement, technologies, I think that's where the real debate and ethics start to go. And what I'm hearing from you is God has still given us boundaries, certain types of constraints that we want to be careful not to push up against. But maybe finding that line, it can be difficult, a difficult
Absolutely.
task, but we got to work hard at it.
It requires wisdom. It requires discernment. But in the New Testament, where it talks about the beauty that women have, it basically points to the heart as the place where they should be beautiful, not necessarily in the clothes they wear or the jewelry they wear or that sort of thing. So the transformation that the Bible points to and Christianity points to is a transformation of the heart. We should be enhanced by eliminating sin, by our sanctification. And ultimately, we will be glorified as a result of that. And that will be a work of God. Glorification is not something that we set out to do, but God will glorify us in His timing.
I mean, not to go too deep theologically here, but I could see someone who holds to what's called a post-millennial view, seeing a place for technology to help proclaim the gospel to all parts, and whether that's broadcasting it, whatever it might be. So there are some, like you mentioned before about the Reformation, having a pushback on certain scientific advances or what have you. It seems like our different theological positions can really inform how we approach technology.
Oh, yes. Well, eschatology can be summed up in the words "God wins," right?
Right.
And so the idea that the technology is going to be a part of God winning, I don't know. That seems kind of odd. There are a lot of I would call them hyper post-millennialists in the transhumanist movement. There are hyper preterists in the movement, so they don't really look for Christ to return at all. It's all up to us to build the kingdom, and that's it. And we don't know how this is going to turn out. We just have to have faith that Christ will come again and fulfill the promises that have been made there. Yeah. I don't have to worry about coming up with a perfect artificial lung or a robot or a computer system, because God in the end will do the heavy lifting.
Maybe one final word is, you work with organizations, with schools, that you're trying to think hard and deeply about technology and its application in that. What would, for the average Christian who may not be specializing in these fields, what wisdom, encouragement would you give them, in dealing with this? Because we're going to keep seeing different technologies come our way. How do we think wisely about it.
Well, yes, the world is going to go its way, but that should not change our trust in Christ and fulfilling what he requires of us. So we should continue to be the people God made us to be, to work to eliminate sin from our lives, to be transformed, to be more human, really, than the transhumanists imagine humanity to be. Somehow the transhumanists believe that your humanity is just your thinking patterns and your memories, and consciousness is some kind of illusion. But God made us as embodied souls, and we have eternal meaning in view of what God has made.
Yeah, there really is almost what some ethicists call the death of humanness now, because the idea of being human is really either being set aside, transformed, or being set aside and placed in favor of what we might call persons or selves. And you're going to share one last book with us.
Right. I was exposed to a fascinating book by Adam Kirsch about a year ago, The Revolt Against Humanity. There are people who despair of us being able to solve environmental problems, and they think, well, maybe the world would be better without human beings at all.
Yeah.
And so you have that on one extreme, and you have transhumanists on the other extreme. It's like, well, nobody wants to be human anymore. Being human is either too much or too little. But God made human beings in his image and likeness, and Christ came in a human body. And being human is a wonderful thing because God made us that way.
Yeah, and he created us so we could ride bikes, too.
Absolutely. Bikes are the ultimate technology.
You have to do a book on the theology of biking or something.
I'm waiting to write it.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, David, for joining us, taking the time, and for all of... I like to thank scholars for all the work that they do behind the scenes, obviously, to come here and bring these thoughts, these reflections, these wisdoms. So thank you for your work in this.
Oh, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
Thanks.